When Albert Finney passed away in 2019, the world mourned the loss of a brilliant actor known for his commanding presence on screen and quiet privacy in life. What few knew was that his Los Angeles residence in the hills of Brentwood had remained eerily untouched for years after his death. A modest, ivy-covered mid-century home tucked behind a high hedge, it was a place Finney had cherished for its seclusion and quiet. Real estate agents described it as frozen in time. The oak floors creaked with age. The study still held rows of first-edition books, and in the corner of the living room sat an old leather armchair that no one dared move. In 2023, the house was finally sold off-market to a young couple from New York, Nathan and Emily Clark, both in their early 30s. Nathan was a commercial photographer. Emily worked remotely for a tech firm. They weren't the typical Hollywood transplants. They were looking for peace, privacy, and a touch of old-school charm. The Finney estate seemed perfect. At first, the house felt exactly like what they'd hoped for: quiet, shaded, with hummingbirds nesting in the eaves. But within weeks of moving in, Emily began complaining about odd drafts in the hallway and the faint scent of cigar smoke in the den, even though neither of them smoked and the HVAC had been recently replaced. Nathan brushed it off. The house was old. Of course it creaked. Of course it smelled a little like its former owner. Then came the sounds. Soft footsteps at night when they were in bed. A rustle of movement near the kitchen door when no one was there. Lights flickering in the hallway and, more than once, the television turning on by itself, always tuned to an old black and white film. Emily was the first to say it aloud. "I think there's someone still here." One night in March, Nathan set up a motion-activated camera in the living room. It wasn't for ghosts, he insisted, but to check for raccoons. What it recorded instead was unsettling. The armchair, the one they had left untouched, rocked slowly for several seconds in the dead of night. No one was near it. No windows were open. After that, Emily refused to enter the room alone. They invited a local historian over, a woman named Teresa Rosales, who had written about the old homes of Brentwood. She told them that Finney had spent most of his last years in that house, reclusive and deeply attached to it. He'd lost his wife there to cancer and never remarried. He reportedly read Shakespeare aloud to himself at night, sipped whiskey at sunset, and hated change. "Some say he never really left," Teresa said quietly, glancing at the dark hallway behind them. "People like that, they settle into the bones of a house." After her visit, the activity intensified. A faint whispering could be heard in the bedroom closet, like the soft recitation of lines Emily, who had studied theater in college, once recognized a quote from King Lear: "I am a man more sinned against than sinning." The next morning, one of Finney's old play scripts mysteriously appeared on their dining table, though it had previously been packed away in a sealed storage box. They tried to bless the house. A local priest came, a sage cleansing, even a psychic, but nothing worked for long. At night, Emily would see a shape standing in the hallway mirror, a tall man in a dark robe, only for it to vanish when she turned. The final straw came in June. Nathan had developed one of his film rolls in his home darkroom, and among the shots of their backyard and a few portraits of Emily, there was one photo that neither of them had taken. A blurry image of the living room taken from a low angle showing the armchair. In the chair sat a man. His face was barely visible, but Nathan swore he recognized it. The sharp cheekbones, the intensity in the eyes. It was Albert Finney. They moved out a month later. The house is once again off-market. Still ivy-covered. Still quiet. And that leather armchair? No one's moved it. Neighbors say the lights still flicker at night. And sometimes if you walk by slowly, in the early hours of the morning, you can hear a voice coming through the cracked window, softly reciting lines from Hamlet. To sleep, perchance to dream. The days in the Brentwood house were warm and quiet, soaked in the kind of California sunlight that softens everything it touches. The vines along the western-facing kitchen window seemed to hum in the afternoon heat, swaying gently even when the air outside was still. It was the sort of place where you could forget the outside world existed, but only during the day. By the third month, Nathan and Emily had begun sleeping with the hallway light on. Not because either of them admitted they were afraid, but because the darkness outside their bedroom door felt somehow too dense. Like something waited just beyond it, not malicious exactly, but patient. Watching. One afternoon, Emily stood alone in the study. It was the only room in the house they hadn't touched since moving in. Not out of neglect, but out of instinct. There was something about the room's stillness that resisted interference, the dark walnut bookshelves that climbed from floor to ceiling, the heavy desk set beneath the wide bay window, and of course, the chair. That goddamn chair. It always faced the window, never turned toward the room, like someone had just stood up from it and planned to return. She stood in the doorway and whispered, "You can have this room. We don't need it." The moment she said it, the air shifted. Not colder, not louder, but fuller. As though the house acknowledged her truce. That night, around 3:10 a.m., the hallway light went out. A bulb popped softly, not a sharp crack. More like a sigh, and the house sank into silence so thick Emily woke without knowing why. Nathan didn't stir beside her, even as she sat upright and turned her head toward the bedroom door. And then she heard it. A low creak. One slow step. Another. Coming from the study. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. She just listened. There it was again. Not footsteps exactly, more like the dull weight of a body shifting on old hardwood. As if someone was pacing in slow, deliberate arcs. Then silence. Then the faintest sound of papers being brushed aside. Emily curled under the covers like a child. Her heart was punching at her chest wall. Her teeth clenched so tight her jaw ached. She stayed like that until the room began to pale with the first hint of sunrise. When Nathan checked the study in the morning, the door which they always kept shut was open. The armchair had been turned ever so slightly toward the center of the room. On the desk, an old hardback book had been laid open. Emily hadn't dared to look at the title. Nathan did. "It's Othello," he said. The page was marked. A monologue circled in pencil. Emily stood in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. "We didn't own that book." "No," Nathan said, closing it slowly. "We didn't." The next few days were uneventful in a way that felt deliberate. The quiet was too complete. The lights stayed on. The air in the house smelled like lemon oil and the faint trace of old books. And then came Sunday. Nathan was developing photos in the darkroom again, this time from a client shoot downtown. Nothing unusual. People, shadows, brick backdrops. Then a still life of the kitchen at home, which he had taken that morning, just a test frame, checking exposure. But in the bottom right corner of the photograph, a reflection appeared in the toaster's chrome edge. A face, half-lit, mouth open slightly, as if mid-word. As not looking at the camera but at him. Nathan blinked, looked again. It was gone. He didn't mention it to Emily. Instead, that night, he quietly boxed up every photo frame they'd hung in the hallway, family photos, childhood snapshots, even the one from their wedding. He didn't know why he did it. Only that they suddenly felt watched, judged even. Emily asked about it later. He lied. Just wanted a change. The next escalation came not in the form of footsteps or whispers, but a memory. One evening, as dusk rolled down over the hills like a gray blanket, Emily stood in the front yard watering the hydrangeas. The neighborhood was silent, save for the distant hum of traffic on Sunset. She turned to go back inside and stopped. In the upstairs window, the one above the study, a figure stood. Not Nathan. The shape was barely distinct, just the silhouette of a tall man in what looked like a dressing gown or robe. He wasn't doing anything, just standing, his face indistinct, staring down at her. She dropped the watering can. By the time she got inside and up the stairs, the window was empty. She found Nathan asleep in the bedroom. The door to the study was closed again, but that night, neither of them slept. A quiet tension stretched between them like a cable pulled too tight. They both knew something had happened. Neither wanted to say what, but it wasn't always frightening. There were nights, rare ones, when the house felt alive in a different way. Gentle. Emily once heard music from the study. Soft, warm piano notes. Not a recording. Someone playing. When she peeked inside, the sound vanished. But the lid to the old upright piano, the one they assumed hadn't been used in years, was open. A single key was pressed down. The note, a low G, resonated in the still air. They weren't ready to leave. Not yet. There was something binding them to the house, now a curiosity, or maybe a mutual understanding. The presence wasn't always malevolent. Sometimes it seemed lonely, old, attached, like a man unwilling to surrender his final audience. Still, every now and then, just before bed, Emily would whisper toward the hallway, "Good night, Mr. Finney." And sometimes, only sometimes, the hallway light would flicker once in reply. By mid-July, Nathan had stopped going into the study altogether. He hadn't spoken about it directly, but Emily noticed the change in his posture whenever he passed the door, how his gaze would flick to it and then quickly away, how his pace quickened just slightly when walking past it at night. The room had become something like a shrine they hadn't asked for, sacred not because of reverence, but because of fear. The door remained closed, no longer locked, just avoided. Still, something about it tugged at them, as if the house had grown a second rhythm beneath the visible world, a current that hummed through the floorboards and collected in corners like mist. It wasn't just the noises anymore. It was the impressions. Emily would walk into the kitchen and feel, unmistakably, as if someone had just left its seconds before her. A cupboard door would hang slightly ajar. A kettle she hadn't touched would be warm. Once, she found the newspaper on the dining table folded open to an article dated April 2005, the year Finney was rumored to have officially retired from acting. Nathan, too, had begun to feel things. One morning while shaving, he felt a pressure at the back of his neck, a heavy, deliberate weight like someone pressing two fingers there, gently but firmly, as if inspecting him. He spun around, razor still in hand. No one. And yet the mirror had fogged up, not from steam, since he hadn't run the water yet, and there, in the misted glass, for words were traced as if by fingertip. "You don't see me," he didn't tell Emily. He wiped it off with the towel and stared at his own reflection for a long time. Then he walked into the bedroom and packed away his camera gear. They were sitting on the back patio one Sunday evening, nursing warm glasses of wine and watching the sun pull long shadows across the lawn. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that usually calmed them. But Emily noticed something strange. A figure walking on the far end of the garden, beyond the hedges. Just for a moment, then gone. She didn't panic, didn't say anything, just stood up and walked the length of the yard. No one, not even footprints in the dew-damp grass. But when she turned to look back at the house, at the upstairs window above the study, the curtains were drawn. They had been open that morning, and she could swear the faintest indentation was visible on the glass, like the oily smudge of a forehead pressed too long against it. That night, as they were brushing their teeth, Emily said, "Maybe we should leave." Nathan rinsed his mouth, stared into the mirror, then shook his head. "We'd be leaving too late." She nodded. She understood. The house had opened a door, and they had stepped through it. Even if they left now, whatever lived here, whatever waited, might not let them go without something in return. The breaking point arrived quietly, without warning, on a cool Wednesday morning. Emily was home alone, working in the upstairs guest room, her headphones on, lost in spreadsheets and Slack notifications. Outside, the sky was pale, overcast, humming with the kind of stillness that makes birds fall quiet. It was the smell that brought her out of it first, faint but distinct. Not rot, not mold, something older, more human. A mixture of old paper, leather, and the bitter bite of whiskey. The scent she'd come to associate with the study. She pulled off her headphones, sat still, listened. A creaking noise, wood shifting under pressure. Not directly beneath her. No nearby. Just outside the guest room door. Another sound. Not footsteps. Breathing. Slow. Deep. Right behind the door. Emily stood slowly. She didn't move closer. Her whole body was tight, as if every muscle knew instinctively not to speak, not to breathe too loud, not to even blink. Then, a voice, low, male, murmuring something indecipherable, soft, almost gentle, like a man speaking to himself while reading. She strained to hear it, recognizing the cadence if not the words. Theatrical, British, measured and musical. The voice stopped. Silence. Then a knock. Just once. A knuckle against wood. Emily stepped back. The doorknob turned slowly, not fully. Just enough to click once, then stopped. No one entered. No footsteps retreating. Just a long, lingering pause that stretched out across the threshold. And then nothing. When Nathan returned home that evening, he found her seated on the staircase, clutching the car keys in one hand and a photograph in the other, an old black and white print she swore she hadn't seen before. It was a portrait of Albert Finney, seated in the very same leather armchair, smiling faintly. But what chilled Nathan most was the background in the mirror behind Finney, barely visible, was the blurred silhouette of a woman standing just outside the frame. She wore a sweater exactly like Emily's. They didn't sleep that night. Instead, they sat on the living room couch until dawn, the lights on, the study door shut tight across the hall. Every creak in the floor, every gust of wind outside felt significant, loaded, as if the house was listening. At one point close to 3 a.m., the piano in the study gave a single, sharp ping. Neither of them moved. The air was electric, heavy. And then, as if cued by some unseen conductor, the hallway light flickered once, paused, then slowly dimmed, not burned out, not broken, just lowered, like a stage curtain falling on a final act. The next morning was blue-gray and silent. A thick marine layer had rolled in from the Pacific, turning the Brentwood streets ghostly and still. It felt like the world had pulled the covers over its head. Nathan and Emily barely spoke. They moved around each other in the kitchen like strangers, their faces pale and drained, as if they had been underwater too long. Nathan made coffee but forgot to drink it. Emily stared out the window but couldn't remember what she was looking for. Something had changed. Not in the way the house looked. The walls were still the soft off-white they'd painted in April. The old floor still creaked in the same places, but in the way it felt. The air inside was heavier now, as if time moved slower here, as if the house had been waiting for something to unfold, and now, finally, it had. That afternoon, they went to the library together, not speaking much, and combed through newspaper archives. Nathan had grown obsessed with finding something, some confirmation that what they were experiencing wasn't just in their heads. Emily wasn't sure what she believed anymore. She only knew that she felt watched everywhere in that house, even in the daylight. They discovered something strange in an interview from 2008, a short piece buried in the arts section of the Los Angeles Times. The interviewer had asked Albert Finney why he had turned down several high-profile film roles in the last years of his life. He answered with an odd smile. "I'm staying in. I've got a new audience now." They sit in silence, but they never miss a line. The quote chilled them both. The article went on to describe his home as a personal theater, with Finney reportedly rehearsing monologues alone into the early hours, often pacing the halls with a whiskey glass in hand. Nathan read the paragraph 3 times before whispering. He never stopped performing. That evening, back at the house, Emily made a decision. "We have to go into the study. Together. Not just peek. We have to be present." Nathan didn't answer at first. He was staring toward the closed study door from the kitchen. Finally, he nodded. They waited until dark. It didn't feel right doing it in daylight. Whatever was in that room, whatever remained, it lived in twilight. In shadows. It was theatrical, after all. At 9:43 p.m., they stood in front of the door. Emily turned the knob slowly. The room greeted them with its usual hush, still as a chapel, cold as a cellar. The armchair sat facing the window. The desk was clear except for one object. A thin black book, freshly placed, its spine worn, pages yellowed. Emily stepped forward and gently picked it up. It was a script, a full annotated production copy of King Lear. Inside the margins, handwritten notes covered every page in thick black pen. Phrases like, "softer here," or "hold breath before saying this line," were scrawled in the edges. Nathan stood over her shoulder, reading silently. And then, from the far side of the room, came the voice. Clear, measured, resonant. "Blow winds and crack your cheeks. Rage, blow." The voice didn't come from a speaker. It didn't echo through the walls. It was in the room with them, low and powerful, as if the man who once spoke it still walked the stage. "You cataracts and hurricanos," spout. Nathan turned to face the empty chair. Emily stepped back, hand pressed to her chest. Till you have drenched our steeples, drowned the cocks. The air around them pulsed. The lamp in the corner began to flicker rhythmically, not violently, but like stage lights dimming between acts. Then silence. And then applause. Soft. A single pair of hands. Clapping slowly. 3 times. Clap, clap, clap. Nathan's legs buckled. He sat down hard on the edge of the desk, breathing like he'd run a mile. Emily whispered, "He's not trapped here." Nathan looked up. "What do you mean?" She looked around the study with new understanding. "He doesn't want to scare us. He just doesn't know the curtain fell. He's still in character." The next day they didn't pack. They redecorated. The study became a library again, not sterile, not untouched, but active. They placed a record player in the corner, bought a few of Finney's favorite jazz albums. They even bought a brand new reading lamp to place beside the armchair. And Emily quietly, without telling anyone, began reading plays aloud in the room. Sometimes Shakespeare, sometimes Chekhov, sometimes just a monologue from a film. It wasn't every night that something happened. But when it did, it was always gentle. A whisper of movement, the faint scent of cologne, a door closing softly behind them when no windows were open. Nathan set up his camera once more, not to catch something but to offer something. He placed it on a tripod, aimed at the armchair, and turned it on. The footage was always the same, the still, empty room, until one night a flicker, barely there, like a man crossing the stage just beyond the edge of the spotlight. A shadow with posture, a hand resting on the arm of the chair, not to be seen, just to be felt. In time, the house quieted, not because it was empty, but because it had been seen, acknowledged, honored. Albert Finney had spent his last years in solitude, performing for ghosts. Now his audience had returned the favor. Nathan and Emily never moved out. They stayed. They lived. They listened. And every so often, just before bed, they would stand outside the study door, Emily resting her head against Nathan's shoulder, and say with a little smile, "Bravo! Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story."